Glad you all are tuning in. So shall we, Bob and Dave?
Sure. Let's do it.
Great.
Let's kick it off.
Yes. So this session is passing along the drip torch. So for those of you who don't know me and weren't in the beginning part of this, I'm Lisa Brush, and I'm with the Stewardship Network, and I'm looking forward to talking about passing the drip torch. And Bob and Dave were both part of starting the Stewardship Network, getting on 25 years ago this year, and they have both recently retired from their jobs, and they were longtime board members of the Stewardship Network. And so we thought we'd do a little bit of reminiscing about some of those times, and are happy to entertain any and all questions that you have. So again, please feel free to make liberal use of the chat. And with that, let you two introduce yourself. So Dave, you want to start?
Sure. Dave Borneman. I recently retired after 28 years with the City of Ann Arbor, Michigan, in the Parks Department, where I ran the Natural Area Preservation Program. In fact, I was brought in to start the program, so kind of launch that and watched it grow to what it is today. Since I retired, I've been doing a lot of prescribed burning. I had a side business doing prescribed burning during my work with the city, seasonally there. And now that I'm done with the city, I can spend more time doing that.
So Dave, it'll be interesting to see how much more burning do you do? Are you able to get more burns in? We want the stats, the pre and post retirement stats.
I'll have to collect those. Last year I did burn. Oftentimes my burn season ended in the past, like in early, maybe mid-May, just because I was backed up on so many other projects. And now that I'm not tied up with those, I burned through May and even into early June. And the main difference I noticed last year is I finally had time after burn season to spend a couple of weeks packing up my gear, cleaning it all, putting it away, and leaving it in better shape for the next season.
That's great.
So
and
that's
Dave, how long have you been doing your Restoring Nature with Fire?
I started that in about 22 years ago.
Yeah.
So with the city for 28 years, and the last 22 of those were doing this on the side.
Mm-hmm. Great. And Bob?
Sure. I'm Bob Grese. I'm a professor emeritus at the School for Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. I retired in summer of 2020 after teaching at the school for about 34 years. And I also had served as director of Matthaei Botanical Gardens and Nichols Arboretum at the university. And I have to say that roughly 25 years ago, I'd been able to get a small grant that allowed us to start the Stewardship Network, and I cornered Dave Borneman and Paul Runchler from the Huron River Watershed Council. And we had a fairly narrow vision of what it could become. And under Lisa's direction, it really took off to what it is now. So it's really great to see this conference and all that's been done through the Stewardship Network.
Yeah, it's true. Prior to starting, I remember driving 5 hours over to Chicago to participate in some of their Chicago Wilderness Volunteer Stewardship Network efforts over there. And on some of those drives back and forth, we're talking about, we should start something like this here in Southeast Michigan. And the rest is history.
And by gosh, we did.
And beyond.
Right? And beyond, right? No, little did we know. Yeah, and I think about those early days when, like I said in the very intro, just last Friday, there were 35 professional stewards, land managers out talking about beaver. And that started 25 years ago, right? I mean, that's to see those kinds of things, the enduring and durable power of bringing people together as Allison said, in community, right? To share around the work that we do. You know, and I remember early in those days, we also just started a discussion group. And so that was at 7:30 in the morning at Reger's Bagels, 7:30 to 8:30 in the morning. Took when we started it, second Tuesday of the month. And there were always some people who were like, you mean the morning? Like, what are you talking about? You know, the whole idea was that we'd get together. You know, if you didn't work in the field, it would be early enough that it was before your work. And if you did work in this field, maybe you start your day a little early, or that would be about when you start your day. And Ray's actually here. Hey, Ray, drop it in the chat. There were the early days when Ray and Bob and Dave and I, and oh, nice. Jason says at least 7 of us on this session were at the beaver hike. So tell us more about the beaver hike. Yeah, but those were those fun early days. That's what somebody said. Sheila said you all braved the cold. Yeah.
Well, and even though it was 7:30 was early for those of us in Ann Arbor, we had people driving in from an hour or further away to get there. At one point, then we decided rather than just being focused in Ann Arbor, we should start some other cluster groups. Although at the time, I think we were going to call them cells. That was just before 9/11 happened.
Mhm.
Then we dropped that name, cells. But
Yeah.
Yeah.
that's how it all got started.
Yeah, and I remember one of my chief motivations was to try to find some way. I mean, there are all these sites around Ann Arbor, like Shanghai Prairie was the one that really struck with me, that, you know, they were outside the jurisdiction of most places that were doing active stewardship. And so how could we create something to really help protect and preserve those areas that needed some care? And the Stewardship Network really initially helped to make that happen. And you're absolutely right, Lisa. I don't think the bagel shop realized what we were up to.
Right.
They took over their whole top floor.
Yep. Moving tables around, asking them to turn off music.
Right. But, you know, yeah, looking back with the benefit of a little bit more hindsight perspective, you know, my background was in environmental education before I came here. And some of the places that I was doing environmental education in Wisconsin, at River Edge Nature Center, I see somebody here from West Bend, Wisconsin at the conference where I used to live. And the nature centers at that time were just doing environmental education. There was no stewardship there of any sort. Since then, I think a lot of nature centers have. But looking back, I feel like that time in the late 80s, early 90s was when there was starting to be a real growing awareness that just setting aside places, saving them from development was not enough. There was a need for some ongoing stewardship. And I was fortunate enough to be able to you know, thankful to the citizens of Ann Arbor that saw that need and created a program to do that sort of thing. And I think the network pretty quickly tapped into that growing need, because we were fortunate. I had a paid position to be able to do this sort of thing, but there are a lot of other smaller organizations that couldn't really afford a stewardship person, but saw the need for it. They really turned to the network to say, we see the need for this, but we don't know how to do it. Help us out.
Yeah, and it was also at that time that I think a lot of land conservancies and land trusts were also really only seeing themselves as preservation. And
Right.
there were some folks on that message on that.
Trying to read chats
I'm
and
reading
talk.
something. I'm reading a chat. Email staff at stewardshipnetwork.org, or try to direct message him, and you'll find him. Let me know if you still need help. Okay, so then the other thing that was happening is one of the things that some of the folks who are on the boards of those land trusts or land conservancies realized is they realized that stewardship was so important, and so they turned to the Stewardship Network to do that, because their boards weren't in favor of it, and they couldn't do it kind of through their land trust, but through the support of the Stewardship Network, they could do that. And that's how, you know, I remember we had done this for 3 years in the greater Ann Arbor area, Washtenaw County. And Bob, as you said, you know, not only Shanghai Prairie, but there's also Eber-White Woods and the work that they were doing there. And before they got involved with the Stewardship Network, they were just thinking about trails. Like, let's just wood chip the trail. And then once they got involved with us, they started to do more management of that property.
Right. And the thing is that I mean, some people looked at us as being experts, but really we only had limited expertise, but collectively we could learn a lot from each other. And that, I think that those early days was a lot of sharing of information, sharing stories, and just like the conference, in terms of helping people really learn from each other and add ideas and think of new ways of doing things.
Yeah.
Right.
And then you go, Dave.
I was going to say, just prior to, or about the time we were starting the network, we were also doing these Stewardship Field Days with that very thing in mind. I had never even been to Southern Michigan before taking the job here in Ann Arbor. So I've been from the Midwest, but I didn't really know what was happening here in Southeast Michigan. So, but there were other people doing that. The Nature Conservancy had some reserves in Southern Michigan. The DNR was doing some things. You were doing things over the university. So it was started off just a chance to take some field trips and go and visit each other and learn from each other and see what everybody was doing. So the networking was an early big part of that.
And clearly there were a lot of concerns about some of the techniques we were using, concerns about using herbicides, concerns about using prescribed fire, and somehow navigating the legal framework or background for what we were doing. I was just thinking the other day, Dave, when your burning program got shut down for a while, and how collectively we could go out and research and find out other champions and other people
Right.
with experience around the country who could lend a hand and help us convince local politicians that it was okay to do.
Exactly. So you, Bob, started burning in Ann Arbor before I got here. And I think you had maybe fewer hurdles to jump over with the university. And so you had already had some track record there. And so we could show up and say, oh, well, the university's already been doing that. So we didn't have to, it was easier to build off of your success there.
Yeah. Well, there were a lot of things could be done at the university, both under research and under education, that, were probably less easy for you in the city to be able to do at that time. But once we started doing it, it set a precedent.
Yeah.
Yeah, and after 3 years of doing this, we thought, okay, this is great, this is awesome, and I was thinking, if I'm going to stay doing this for, little did I know, 25 years, it needs to be really cool. So we brought together, again, that whole idea of learning from each other. We brought together folks from lake to lake across southern Lower Michigan who are doing this kind of work, and David was part of that, who's on this. Ray was part of that, who's on this. Mike Apple, you were part of that too, and other and folks from all over. And so we brainstormed, and we had a great time. And in the morning, I'd make muffin mix at home, and we'd meet over at the Leslie Science Center, and I'd put the muffins in the oven, and we'd have the smell of muffins, and we'd brainstorm about how we do this restoration work. And we thought big and small, and are we a network of networks, or are we just a network? And one of the things that came out of that, Ray, I remember you and Sherry, Ray Fulsing, who's on this call, who's on this from Michigan Department of Natural Resources State Park Stewardship Program, and Sherry Lair, who was with the Nature Conservancy, you both said this needs to be bigger geographically. And the thing that, Bob, I remember you were the one who said, oh, great, what, we're going to become a statewide organization and just have a conference. Like, the whole thing that makes this work is that you're talking to people and about places that you know and love, right? And so that's when we thought long and hard about, like, how could we do this in a meaningful way? And that's when we launched and piloted what has now become Grand Raisin and the headwaters. Again, as Dave said, we were calling them cells at that time because we really loved that thought. Like, you've got a cell, and then you put those cells together, and you got a leaf, and you put those more cells together, and you got a tree, and the interconnectedness of it. And then 9/11 happened, and we were like, that's not going to fly anymore. So we started calling.
And Lisa, I think one of the things that we really, really, really depended on was your strong facilitation skills, that you were great at listening and hearing the different ideas, hearing the needs that people had, and helping us translate that into an organization that could really be action oriented and really, empower people, whatever organizations and wherever they were, to really become part of this. And so I think you need to take a lot of credit for helping shape what has happened this last 25 years.
Yeah, it's been pretty cool. But the thing about it is that you all know, right? So we go into a community, and that's what we do, is we say, what do you need? We don't ever say, this is what you should do. And then when we do that, and it really is, it's quite powerful, I think, for a lot of the people who are experiencing that. I think that there have not always been a lot of places where that is the way that you operate. And so from there, it just grew. We had those first 3, and then more and more folks said to us, will you do this around the state? And I said, absolutely not.
Yeah, we had to find some creative funding. I remember, those first few years really talking about how we'd keep this sustainable, because we were hanging by a thread for a while.
We sure were.
Yeah. To echo Bob's comment earlier, I wanted to just say, Lisa, your facilitation skills and your ability to help grease any potential friction spots. Sometimes when organizations are competing for dollars or for volunteer help or something, it can be seen as kind of a scarcity. Well, that's our volunteer, or that's our grant project. And you did a great job of navigating that and just doing away with those concerns for the most part. So I think that's been a big part of the success of the network.
Yeah, thank you. It really has been, it's been fun to watch it shift. I remember when we first went out to New England, Aaron Mittendorf, who worked with us, Aaron and I went out there and we launched the Stewardship Network New England. And one of the things that Aaron said is like, oh, I'm a network native. Like I didn't see the before attitudes and the before approaches of like, no, these are my volunteers and these are,
Right.
I'm not going to tell you this stuff. And now it's open source, open land.
Yep.
Yeah. And it's really been fun. And it's been, and so what happened after, after another 3 years, as I said, I turned to we had an advisory committee, and I turned to our advisory committee and I said, these demands to do this in other places are still coming. So I think we're onto something unique, and I think maybe we should respond. And that's when we went ahead and said yes. And we incorporated as the Michigan Stewardship Network, a 501c3 nonprofit. We very, very quickly never operated as Michigan Stewardship Network because we were launching a group in Southwest Michigan. And I knew immediately that our Indiana partners there. So we started operating as just Stewardship Network. And then the story is more and more folks from across the country said, will you do this? And we said, no way, we do not have the capacity. And now we do. And it's quite incredible to be operating, all of our groups in California that are working with, over 400 different groups and removing hurdles and barriers, to the work of the Great Lakes Islands, as I mentioned, to Duluth. And we're talking with Baltimore right now.
Yeah, well, prior to the network, I used to if I needed to turn to others for professional advice, I would go to the Natural Areas Conference or the Society for Ecological Restoration, both of which had big national conferences. And those are useful, but as a city employee, I was one of the few city employees there, certainly probably the only city employee from a town as small as Ann Arbor. There were some of the larger cities, New York or Chicago, may have people doing this. But time and again, I would be talking to people at these conferences and talking about invasives control or prescribed fire, and they would say, you're doing all this in city parks? Back in the early 90s, there weren't many cities around and that were doing that. And so it's been fun to see over the last 30 years, the number of cities, counties, townships, and nonprofits, land trusts and things that are really getting into the stewardship game.
I'll tell a story. And Ray, again, it's fun that you're on this, because this is the story of, we were doing a workshop, a 3-part series on invasive species control. And Ray and I were leading this first session, and we only had 3 people sign up. And I know what it takes to start things. And I know that you just can't expect 25 people at your first event, even though sometimes when people lead events that they say, I'm not going to do it unless there are 25 people. And I remember, Ray, you and I were going to have to get up at 5 o'clock and drive across the state to do this workshop. And I was like, oh, I know if it was in my own backyard, I'd do it. And I just think we need to. And Ray, thank you for being so game to do that. But we did the first workshop, and then we did the second workshop had 6 people, and then the third workshop had 12. But the coolest thing that came out of that, 2 of the 3 people worked for a county parks department in maintenance and stewardship, essentially. And they came to all 3 sessions. And about a month later, I got a call from the director of that parks department, and he said, what'd you do to my guys? He said, I've been trying to talk to them about stewardship for the longest time, and all they wanted to do was mow, and now they're completely converted, and we're doing stewardship. So then this is the kind of ripple effect that I love with these kind of things. So Dave, to your point about there are more folks doing this, they now have a natural areas program, and they have an employee who actually started out as our first coordinator in West Michigan, and she now runs that program. And so pretty cool ripple effect from those kinds of things. And so yeah.
Well, to your earlier comment about that, early on, people were so concerned that stewardship would take away from land preservation. And when you look at what's happened here locally around the Ann Arbor area, that all of the townships, many of the townships around us now have natural areas programs. They're buying and protecting land or putting conservation easements on land. The county's program has been really successful. And so the total amount of land under stewardship and protection around us has just grown phenomenally. And I think that is really one of the ripple effects, that people started to see what a difference it could make to protecting lands and restoring some of the ecological integrity to it. And, dollars followed, tax dollars followed to help protect land. And to provide stewardship for it too.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
So Bob, I was curious to know, looking back, what do you wish that you knew 30 years ago about stewardship that you know now after all these years?
Oh, gee, I don't know. I think that, in some ways, there were some programs that started and stopped. So, like early on, I mentioned Shanghai Prairie, and we really didn't get a core group started there, but it's picked up here lately again, and with the help of St. Joe Hospital and the Stewart and the Sierra Club and some other groups. So I think it's easy to get frustrated early on by feeling like you're not having as much traction and or that the original goals you set don't happen quite as you thought they would. And
Right.
so, being flexible for the long term, I think, is really critical, and not being too disgruntled when you try to lay out a program and it doesn't happen quite as you would expect it. I mean, to me, that's one thing that I've learned, that just the need to be adaptable going forward and to keep listening to people and meeting them where they are, and hopefully something will grow from that.
Yeah.
How about you, Dave?
Well, I mean, piggyback on that one first. I learned that same thing. When I started, I looked at the parks in the city, and for me, that was the starting point where they were. So, an area that was local people might know this, Barton Nature Area in Ann Arbor. At the time, it was along the river. It was pretty shrubby with some little pockets of prairie, but kind of shrubbing in and adding more trees and things. So I saw that prairie. I knew how to maintain prairie. We should start burning and trying to keep those areas open. And we did that for many years, and had some great burns there, lots of shrub cutting. And as I neared my end of my career with the city and looked back on it, I realized we were not making a lot of progress there towards making that be a prairie. And maybe that didn't want to be a prairie. It was turning into not a prairie, but a perfectly good floodplain forest there. And it's easy to kind of put your head down and march ahead at what you're doing all the work to get where you think you need to be. And it's good to sit back and take a fresh look sometime and see, is this really where we should be going? So in terms of being flexible, that would be my thoughts as well too. Don't, plans are good, but make sure that you are looking at it with fresh eyes and not being stuck to something that maybe is not the right goal in the long term.
Yeah, it's as Allison was saying, that adaptability and resilience. And then it definitely is also, it's the long game that we're playing here, right? I mean, that's just in all of this work. And so it's to, take the small wins as they come and continue to learn from them. And that's why talk like Allison's is so inspiring, right? Or the webcasts that we do that feature those kinds of things.
Yeah, the other thing that I love is I think that you think about setting priorities and when you're going to spend your time, because you clearly can't hit all the properties that are in need of some sort of restoration, that having some sites that are very public where people will see them and respond to them and really get attached to the kind of stories that are there, but then also balancing that with other areas that won't take as much effort to really protect and preserve, that you need to keep both pictures in mind of what it resonates in a place that people will love and care for, but then also those hidden sites that maybe not everyone knows about, but are really key for protecting and stewarding.
Yeah, the whole prioritization thing was huge for me. Early on, it was easy to go in, have a work day, clear out all the shrubs, check it off our list, pat ourselves on the back and say, well, we're done with that, only to come back 5 years later and realize that it had grown shut with shrubs again. And just recognizing that when you pick an area to work in, this is not a one and done, this is a long-term commitment. So pick those areas carefully, because if you're in a lower priority site, it's going to take a lot more effort there than if you're in an area that's more intact. So choose your battles carefully and be ready to stay in them for the long run.
Yeah, that's great. So as you two think about the kind of the stewardship network and the cross-boundary learning and the lean years that we went through, I remember there was a time when Ray, again, I was on the phone with you, and I said to Ray, I was like, I sure hope this grant comes through before the board meeting. And I think this was a time it was a really small board, because I don't want to say we only have $1,000 in the bank. But that's the truth of it. There was I think a time, many of you have heard me tell this story where I say that I used to always say we need somebody who cares about money at the Stewardship Network, but it was when somebody came and saw everything that we had and what was going on, and he was like, "Oh, no, you just didn't let a lack of money get in the way of a good idea." I was like, "Yeah, thank you. That's true too." Yeah, we weren't going to stop it because of no money. We were going to get through it and come to the place where we are now, where it's really a very exciting time for us. Yeah. So as we think about, kind of some of the leadership and the vision that you two provided, where do you think, did you imagine this?
Only in our wildest dreams.
No, I don't think so. I think it's just, to me, what is very rewarding is that we clearly saw a need. We shared ideas about what this organization would be, and we went for it. And not knowing exactly what it would be like, but clearly started something with the idea of filling a need for protecting and caring for land locally. And it's been wonderful to see how it's grown and really branched out around the country for sure.
Yeah, I kind of feel like I mentioned earlier, I feel like my career with the city started about the same time this awakening of stewardship, the need for stewardship was happening around the Midwest at least. And so I was hired with a 5-year property tax millage and with a warning that, this is not guaranteed long term. And for many years, I felt like we were kind of the new novel program. And then eventually I looked around and realized I was the longest serving tenured employee with the Parks Department. And what had started off as a novelty was now pretty well set in stone and accepted. And I think that's the case around the community. It's no longer such a strange idea. Stewardship has more and more legitimacy, thanks in no small part to the Stewardship Network. And so I feel like funding gets to be easier. Long-term commitments from organization gets to be easier. And it's just really satisfying to see kind of how this whole thing has blossomed and taken on a life of its own.
Yeah, and I think it was helpful that, the early conversations where you, Dave, with the city, you had sort of a limited geographic range that you were expected to care for.
Right.
Paul Rentschler from the Watershed Council had sort of a larger watershed really that could be part of his jurisdiction. And I had no geographical limitations because I wasn't, at that time, I wasn't the director of the Botanic Gardens or Arboretum. I just a faculty member that was interested in stewardship, and so I could do whatever I wanted.
I always envied that. I was always jealous of that.
Yeah, that's great. It's also, let us know if you all have questions. Drop them in the chat there. If there's anything that you're wondering about or want to hear us tell stories on. And I think about how this event started. And this event was first conference was in 2008, and so 16 years ago. And it was one of these things where I felt like I was watching the network just grow. I was watching and I was seeing all parts of this network, and it was so cool. And I could see those connections, and I felt like I was in a really unique spot to see it. And it was I was probably the only one that could see all of it. And so I said to the board of directors, I think that we need to hold a convening of some kind, and the whole question was, how can it really be a meaningful convening? And one of the things that the board said is like, whoa. We are not paying you on a regular basis, and we're going to hold an event that costs $50,000. And I remember the healthy dialogue and debate in the board meeting about that. And I said, I really think we need to, and I think you need to go out on a limb with me. And I'm happy to come back and say I was horrifically wrong, but I really think we should try it. And so that first year we had a great planning committee. We had a professor, a student, a volunteer, a land manager. I think that was it, right? I think maybe those were the we were kind of trying to represent our audience and as a planning committee. And we held this event not knowing if 50 people were going to show up, if 75, 120. And we said we would hold it periodically because we didn't want to make any commitment to holding it all along. And so 320 people showed up, and there was so much energy in the room. it was 320 people from all around who were doing stewardship, and people said people loved it. They thought the diversity of the representation was amazing, and we've been doing it ever since.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
And I was thinking back to other lessons that I had learned over my career, and one of our keynote speakers from a few years ago, Robin Wall Kimmerer, I think summarized one of my big lessons that I had learned pretty well. I think her words were something like, what's broken is not just nature, but our relationship to nature. And it was easy for me early on to focus on using my ecological training from grad school and stuff, trying to just restore the nature. And especially being in the parks department with the city, it became obvious pretty quickly that we also needed to build in the human component. And our keynote speaker today talked about the importance of working with the volunteers there as well. That was certainly a big part of what we did in the city. And I think many of the successful programs around also have a large volunteer component. So it's really about, land in many ways is just a tool we're using to try to do the more important work of healing this relationship that we have between humans and nature.
Tell your singing to the lake story.
Yeah, and I the research that I did, sort of looking at volunteers and how they cared about land, it's really true that the stewardship activities really create a strong sense of attachment in place, that people really care about it and they're willing to fight if something threatens that. So it's really, I think it's really been key that the stewardship activities, more than in some ways more than some other environmental ed programs, really help to build that kind of sense of connection to a place that's so critical in terms of building that relationship, like you said, Dave.
Yeah. Lisa, the story I'll tell instead is being at a conference years ago through the Natural Areas Association. I was on the board for that. And early on in my career, I would look at the conference schedule, and I had every talk label a circle that I wanted to do so I could get the most out of this talk, out of this 4-day conference or something. And there was a gap in there where I didn't have a really good talk to go to, and I was instead going to go and sit in on something called the Forgotten Language Tour that was being put on by the Orion Society in conjunction with our conference. And it was a bunch of nature writers talking about feelings about nature and some fluffy thing. It wasn't telling me how to kill bad plants or do prescribed fire or anything like that. But I sat in there to listen to these speakers and never left the room. It was the most compelling part of the conference. That's the only part I remember now, years later, hearing people tell their story about their connection to the land, how they connected to nature. And it was really powerful for me. And I realized how important that human component is to what we do. Many of us, I think any of us that are out doing this work as our career, don't do it because we had a professor that taught us this in school. Maybe they did, but there's always going to be some kind of a human component with it. I heard people at that conference talk about they grew up in a city, but there was this vacant lot next to them where they went out and connected with nature. And that made me realize that our city parks, yes, they have some great biodiversity, but even more importantly, they are places where residents of the city can go off and commune with nature. Maybe the only spot where they get to do that.
Yeah, and that's, Bob, to your point earlier about, those, there are some places that are highly biologically diversity value, and then other places that are just really valuable because it's a place where a kid can go run around and make a fort and make those early connections. Yeah, that's great. One of the things that Jason dropped into the chat is he remembers a time when Dave, you asked Bob to come talk to city staff. And then he also remembers a time when Bob, you asked Dave to talk to the U of M folks. And so just that kind of like, okay, you hear me going on about this and you think I'm a broken record about this, but let me bring you another perspective. And so sometimes those outside experts are a little bit easier to listen to.
Yeah, it always helps that somebody outside your organization is more of an expert than you are.
Yeah. Because that allows you to say, boy, that was a really good idea that Bob said, we should think about that.
Yeah. Well, and then, one of the other things that maybe would be worth talking about too is also the whole idea that we found, maybe we should tell the stories about, those, no, these are my volunteers, I don't want to share them. And how what we found when we started to actually do these volunteer work days across boundary and go ahead and share these other things, and that the NAP volunteers would be able to hear this not only from Dave, but you could go to the Steward Circle and you could hear it from other people, and now that circle is just even so much greater.
Yeah. you're right. We have the city works with lots of volunteers, both for individual work days, but they also have volunteer stewards who are longer term have longer term connection to different parks. And at the beginning, those stewards' only connection to the restoration world was through us. And we may have our own views about what should be done in the park, and they would have different views about it, or didn't have any other source of information. So the network gave them a whole another world out there that they could turn to get some other perspectives. And so it helped to make that experience much more legitimate. It wasn't just the city staff that were talking to them about restoration, but this larger network as well.
Well, I also think that a lot of people that came to volunteer with city work days or at the Arboretum or the Botanic Gardens, oftentimes they took those ideas home to apply in their own little piece of property. And, people, suddenly found that there's many scales that they can do this kind of restoration work, from places right at home to bigger places that they might drive to for an hour or so. But all of those are important in terms of feeding each other to protect regional biodiversity.
Yeah. And it's, I think, I'm not quite sure if now is our real time, but I think so. I mean, the America the Beautiful, the 30 by 30, kind of initiatives that are happening at a national level. And they're really at that large scale, they're really starting to acknowledge that it is the locally led efforts that are so important, and the community that gets built. And the thing that I've always said is, that's also what makes it really resilient, right? And that's what keeps it going, because it's not dependent on just one person telling somebody what to do, but it's really organically derived in terms of what does a community need, and what are we gonna do there. It's also maybe worth a moment now in talking about that kind of stuff to talk a little bit about the Stewardship Network Fund Dream that I have been kind of vetting for the past, it's probably getting on 7 years now. But we do a lot of pass-through funding to our member communities. We help them. Like I said, we're writing a grant with the Great Lakes Islands Alliance to the Mott Foundation, and we're working with Lori on a grant to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, get some money. We've been able to pair, aggregate projects together with our different member communities. That makes it more, upland habitat, not only in, Southeast Michigan, but we can make it broader than that and make it more appealing to funders. So we do a lot of that work, a lot of that hoop jumping. We know how to jump through hoops that are big and small and moving, and just the funding world that it is. And so I started to think, what if we had a Stewardship Network fund, $150 million fund? Could not say 150 million with a straight face 7 years ago. And that would fund this work. And I said to people, I started to vet it all across the country. And I said, laugh me out of the room, right? What a ridiculous idea that is. Tell me we're not the right group. Who the heck is the Stewardship Network to do that? Tell me that somebody else is already doing that. Don't you know that, bozo? And I literally, to a person, got nothing but positive response. And even groups that were, when I started to say it to some groups who definitely have kind of capacity around that, and I was a little nervous about saying it to them, but I wanted to keep vetting it because I didn't want to go down this path. And they were like, if you can crack that nut, because that stewardship money is hard to come by, because it's the sexy preservation stuff, as I said in the intro, those big celebrated moments that people want to fund. They want to help you buy that property. They want to help you set that land aside. And the stewardship stuff, we just know how important it is. And the thing that I love is, with us, you only get stewardship. You don't have a choice of saying, I want the sexy, set this land aside with my name on the preserve. You get the ongoing celebration of stewardship work. And so for the last year, we have been we've been putting legs on the concept, so that if I come to you and say, would you be interested in making $1 million gift, a $10 million gift, I'm going to have answers to your questions. And so we really have legs on that. For the last 12 months, we've been doing that. And this is the year that we're going to start to raise the money for the initial anchor donors so that we can do the proof of concept. And my thought, and again, I'm completely willing to fail. There is no money in this fund yet, right? So this is the whole, we'll see where this goes. But I really think I've also had people in the development world who work with non-resource constrained people, as they say, who say, it's a great idea. And I really think that you'll be able to find people. You just have to start knocking on doors and answering them. So I'm really looking forward to, the thought is that we are going to put some legs on this year and start to see some anchor donors and start to distribute money to member communities in 2024. And we've been preparing our member community coordinators for how might the ask go and what does that look like. And again, I'm excited about it for, the part of the grant where you have to tell who you are and legitimize yourself. Like, you don't have to do that because we already know you. You're already a member community. We already know intimately what you do. And then I'm really looking forward to the cross-pollinating. So it's pretty exciting.
Yeah. Well, land preservation might be sexy in some way, but I like the time lapse photography that Allison showed. I think those are really powerful stories. I was wishing we'd had some video like that. With the city had lots of before and after photos, and I think those are pretty cool as well, because you really get to see what that money does. You're taking this bare ground parking lot invasive filled thing and then turning it into something that looks much more sustainable and healthy and biodiverse. I think the photos, the before and after photos that I would show of our parks in Ann Arbor were always one of the more powerful things that we could do, tools we could use to communicate with the public.
Yeah, and Lisa, I'm struck that, as we sit here and try to reflect back on what the past has been like and thinking about how we started as an idea and a collaboration effort, it seems like this is really the logical next step for the Stewardship Network to create a fund like this that really carries the work forward and makes it much more powerful going forward. So I really applaud your efforts to keep fighting for that.
We'll see where it goes. And it's funny. It's as Celia said, she said it's just going to be that you're going to do the same thing that you're doing, but you're just going to be better funded. And I said yes, and we'll have more control of those funds. So that was also, that's exactly right. There's no, we're going to still do member community stuff, and they're going to be better funded. And some of them, coordinators, we have 4 paid coordinators who are part of our extended staff. And so, having this be a career that they can continue to build on.
Well, I think also, the ability to have some funds to really help address some unmet need that you couldn't do any other way is so valuable. When we got started, we got some funding through a consent agreement from a pollution over at the Willow Run Bomber Factory site. And, those funds were really critical to just help it get started. And so having some seed money to really do something creative when the need is there, I think is really critical. And I would trust the Stewardship Network to be able to do that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. One of the other things about it is also the things that the capacity money is really hard to come by. Like when we were talking with the Baltimore folks, one of the things that they were saying is it's really hard to get money to just bring people together, right? Because in that instance, you can even say, and I don't even know what they're going to do, right? That money is really hard to come by, and that's where those creative ideas come. And I think that we know that. And then the other thing that we also know, we were in, I started to share this publicly, probably our last in-person conference. And I remember Alison Catalano was in the back of the room, and she said, hey, the other thing that I think, so she's the one who talked about failure in conservation. And She said she came from airline and military, and where there's a lot of after action, and they do a lot of sharing of mistakes so that they don't happen again. And she did her PhD on failure in conservation. And so the importance of telling those stories and learning from each other on them. And she said, hey, I think if the Stewardship Network I'm trying to get away from the language around grants, but if the Stewardship Network is the one giving you your funds, I bet they're going to want to hear your lessons learned. They're not going to want you to sugarcoat this, right? Because we want to share those lessons back out.
Sure.
Yeah. Also worth noting that Tina dropped in the chat, so grab that link and go to it after the session. Some of Dave's favorite before and after photos.
Thank you, Tina.
Yeah. So what are you two doing now? You were saying, Dave, you're doing burning stuff, but what else are you up to?
Doing burning things, but also one of the things that made it harder, or made it easier to decide it was time to retire is we bought a cabin 3 hours north in northern Michigan that I spent a lot of time at, and harder to do that when I was trying to be in the office in Ann Arbor. So spending time up there and doing some restoration on the land I own up there now. But yeah, spending more time both with the burn program, but being able to also meet with clients and do some more consulting just about their land. My environmental ed background and training still is with me, and I like nothing more than to wander around a piece of land with someone and let them see it through my eyes from a restoration standpoint, and kind of hopefully use the things that I learned about setting priorities, being reasonable about what's you can expect of the land and how to get there. So spending more time doing that.
Nice. And Bob?
Well, I'm continuing to do a little teaching. I'm advising a group of master's students on a project with the Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy in West Michigan.
Oh, great.
And so that's been rewarding to keep in touch with students. I've continued to volunteer out at the Botanical Gardens and Arboretum. And then I've been looking at other volunteer opportunities too. So I'm working a bit with the Give 365 program with the Ann Arbor City Parks to help do some cleanup on some park sites that had some need. I'm working with Avalon Housing on a food bank, and I am still a member of the county's Natural Areas Technical Advisory Committee. So that keeps me involved in the conservation community too.
Yeah.
So all those things keep me pretty busy.
Yep. That's great. I know.
They're all fun.
Exactly. I can't imagine that either one of you are wanting for things to do, but looking at them. So as we think about, if you were to think about looking forward and offering advice to the Stewardship Network as you two, and then others of you online also have always done that. And our ears are always open for what you need and what the community needs, and any thoughts and advice that you might have for the Stewardship Network moving forward, or just reflections on, being here at this moment in time. Should we go back in person? Is virtual good because they don't have to travel?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I always get a big jolt of energy out of the in-person conferences. It was fun to see familiar faces or people that I have worked with over the years and see them in person. And there's so much good learning that happens outside of the sessions, just in the hallway and things. But it is hard to get as many people together in person anymore. So I see the pros and cons of either one. I'm not sure what the right answer is.
I think that it's key to stay true to your mission. And I think, fortunately, the Stewardship Network has a pretty compelling mission over these years, and, hasn't limited it too much in terms of geography or other sorts of things. But realizing that you can't be everything to everybody, to stay true to what you do best. And this conference, a lot of the effort you've been talking about, Lisa, in terms of trying to fund groups and bring them together, those things are powerful enough, and the Stewardship Network is unique in doing that. So I think just keeping focused on the things that the network can do best, but also being willing to experiment at the edges.
Yeah, that's great.
Just thinking out loud here, I suppose one of the things that continues to happen over the last few years is that harder to get everybody who's here today from all around the country together in person. So, and I'd hate to limit that. So maybe there's a blend of having conferences like this that bring in the wider audience, yet more back to our old Stewardship Field Days or field trips or things where we have opportunities to connect with people locally.
Yeah,
I would agree that some blend makes a lot of sense in terms of what we've learned from this pandemic in terms of being online, but also not forget the importance of the face-to-face.
Right.
Yeah, it's, I think we are going to go back in person, because it just is, we'll find some way to also hold some event like this as well. But I really think there is so much energy that comes from being together. And so we'll do something in 2024.
And maybe there can be cells, going back to the idea of cells and networks.
Yep.
Networks help us do that, or digital networks help us do that sometimes. Have local groups that are connected.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, Bob and Dave, we're coming to the end of our time here. Thank you. So great to reminisce and good to be with you. And thank you so much for your early vision and leadership and what you both have done in the community, and for being really good friends. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for your leadership and all your hard work too.
Yeah, you're welcome for the early vision, and thanks for carrying it through beyond what Bob and I could ever have imagined. It's great to be part of the network and to see it grow.
Yeah, you're welcome. So I just want